Hey everyone, today's story is about a woman who defeated the Demon King as a level 99 warrior. But then she quits everything and becomes a normal housewife. However, when a hidden dungeon appears, she gets dragged back into battle. And the craziest part, she's still insanely overpowered. So with that said, let's begin the story. Hidden dungeons. These are mysterious labyrinths that, according to legend, appear after the Demon King is defeated. There, unknown monsters roam in the darkness, and untold treasures lie hidden, accessible only to the bravest. The royal capital, Altia. The streets were noisy and crowded. Residents poured out of their homes, gathered at intersections, and shouted that the Demon King had finally been defeated. The heroic squad that defeated the Demon King had returned, and the entire city came out to greet them. Suddenly, however, the crowd fell silent. People exchanged surprised glances, counting the returnees. There were only 3 of them. One of the townspeople shouted out first, "Where's the 4th one? Where's Lady Nirvana, the Holy Fist? Why didn't she show up?" Others immediately echoed the cry, and a discordant chorus of bewildered questions hung over the square. Meanwhile, just outside the city limits, a short distance away, a girl named Yui Nirvana, the Holy Fist, threw a bag of clothes to the ground, and she stared intently at the city. She was a 99th level martial arts master. Pink hair, an alert, stern gaze, bangs casually swept to one side, and a high ponytail on the left. Her armor hugged her figure tightly. Heavy gauntlets and boots completed the look of a warrior accustomed to battle, not parades. She was a member of the heroic squad that had destroyed the Demon King. Yui's fists had attained sacred mastery. For this, she was given the honorary title of Holy Fist. Each of her strikes brought instant death. A single warrior, equal to 1,000. Her blows split the earth and tore the heavens apart. A demonic fist that could break even giants. No monster could evade her godlike speed. She toyed with those from whom others fled without looking back. Legends claimed that her fists were forever drenched in the blood of monsters. But behind this mastery lay something more than mere talent. 10 years ago, a monster killed her father. It was then that Yui swore to destroy the root of evil, the Demon King himself. 10 years of grueling training forged this sorrowful fist for the sake of a single blow. Though she was always lightly equipped compared to the others, she was the one who invariably fought on the front lines. Her battles constantly teetered on the edge of fatal wounds and critical conditions, a dance of death performed over and over again. However, it was her fanatical devotion to her father's memory, combined with her merciless fighting style and habit of walking the edge of destruction, that made her a warrior elevated to the rank of Holy Fist. Her entire team stood at a distance as she brought down the Demon King, who towered before her like a colossal dragon. With a single blow, Yui grimly climbed onto its head, looked down menacingly, and froze for a moment, trying to comprehend that what she had lived for all these years had finally come pass. On this day, she completed her 10-year mission. The girl turned and began to walk calmly away from the city. With one smooth motion, she pulled the metal hairpin holding her hair back from her head, and finally let herself go. She smiled happily, looking up at the sky, expecting that things would only get better from here on out. She whispered softly that she was finally returning home. Her hometown was the fishing port of Amizu on the eastern slope, a remote town on the very edge of the eastern region. After just a short while, she arrived at the place she hadn't been to in 10 years. Unlike her, this place had hardly changed. Yui looked around nostalgically, comparing the past with the present, and walked slowly along the familiar streets toward her home. On the way, she wondered if her mother was still angry with her. Though, on the other hand, everything would be different now. She would stay in Amizu and become the best daughter in the world. When she approached her house, she found nothing but ruins. Everything was destroyed. The bag with her belongings slipped from her hands and fell to the ground. She didn't even notice. She cried out in surprise, not understanding what had happened. How was this even possible? The next second, she rushed to her father's grave. Only now, there wasn't a single headstone there. There were 2. The second one read that the mother of the Holy Fist rested here, having finally found peace beside her beloved husband. Nirvana stared at it in shock. She sank to her knees, tears streaming down her face. She refused to believe it. No, this couldn't have happened. She asked her father for forgiveness for not being able to protect even her mother. She asked herself, what was the point of those 10 years anyway, if she wasn't there when she was truly needed? Then a quiet rustle sounded from behind. Someone's cart rolled past. Nirvana didn't pay any attention. With tears in her eyes, she looked up at the sky, searching for answers, and thought that this was her punishment for leaving this beautiful city and the people she loved. She stood up and gripped the strap on her shoulder that held the bag tightly. Then a familiar voice rang out behind her. A guy passing by stopped and asked her to wait. Could it really be her? He recognized her. It was Yui, his childhood friend. He walked over quickly and stopped beside her. He was short, about a head shorter than the girl, dressed in simple overalls that reached mid-thigh and a white top, wearing a beret with a visor, his black hair curly. He blushed slightly. Nirvana looked at him intently. Then her eyes widened. Something clicked in her memory, and she gasped in surprise. It was her childhood friend, Ryuta. She remembered how, from a very young age, they had always been together, running through the streets, and him weaving flower wreaths for her, telling her they looked great on her. Both of their parents used to joke that they were the perfect couple. With tears in her eyes, Yui looked at him and quietly whispered his name. Ryuta invited her to his place. A short while later, at his house on the outskirts of town, the young man bustled around his guest, unable to hide his delight. It really was her. 10 years had passed, and she had grown up so much. Although Nirvana was nearly a head taller than his best friend, it didn't bother him in the least. Yui muttered that Ryuta, unlike her, hadn't changed a bit. The guy gasped, raised an eyebrow, and said with feigned offense that he had grown, just not in a way that was immediately obvious. A little while later, the girl was sitting at the table, staring at the candle flame and watching her friend bustle around the house. She was truly happy that Ryuta had stayed just the same as he was. That was what made her truly happy, without any reservations. The guy rushed to the stove and the cupboards, muttering that Yui must be hungry. A few minutes later, a veritable feast was laid out on the table. Looking at all this abundance, Yui gasped and told her friend that it was simply amazing. Ryuta was a level 24 fisherman, and his homemaking skill was maxed out. Pouring her some soup, he said with a smile that he'd live alone for a while, so she should eat as much as she wanted. The heroine blushed, began to eat quickly, and opened her eyes wide in shock. It was truly delicious. Her friend smiled broadly, exclaimed that he was glad, and urged her to eat. Silence reigned at the table for a few minutes. Everything was being devoured at an enviable speed. Then Yui decided to speak up. She asked quietly, "Did Mom really die 3 years ago?" The guy next to her nodded silently. Nirvana remembered the flowers on the grave and noticed exactly the same ones on the mantelpiece. She muttered quietly, "So he brought flowers to Mom and the others, didn't he?" Ryuta deliberately ignored the question, frowned intently, and asked what she was going to do next. The main character raised her eyebrows slightly, smiled, wrapped her hands around her cup, and muttered that she had never thought of anything other than a peaceful life with her family. Ryuta clenched his hands into fists and looked at his girlfriend. Then he lowered his gaze to the table and muttered that he had no idea what she'd been doing all these 10 years. But he'd always known she'd definitely come back here. Yui looked at him in surprise, sensing that he was trying to say something important. Ryuta blushed deeply, but looked at her resolutely and firmly told her to marry him. Nirvana stared at him with wide eyes, leaned back in her chair, and blushed slightly from the surprise, and asked, bewildered, what on earth was he talking about? Yui remembered who she was. A 99th level martial arts master. For 10 years, all she had done was kill monsters. And now marriage? She blushed deeply just thinking about it. She was a martial arts master with 0 experience points in love. That was a whole different dungeon, and she'd never had a map for it. Just then, Ryuta called out to her, snapping her out of her thoughts. He shouted fiercely that he was completely serious. Then, more quietly, without the same intensity, he added, that day, he hadn't been able to save her father from the monsters. Afterward, he hadn't been able to heal her wounded heart. So now he was asking her to let him protect her, his beloved Yui, from now on and forever. Nirvana gasped loudly. A critical hit. She blushed deeply and couldn't utter a word. She thought to herself that there really was someone who had been waiting for her all this time, someone who cared so deeply for her. Then memories flooded back. She remembered how her mother had stroked both their heads and said they were the perfect couple, and that she would gladly force them to marry if she had to. With tears in her eyes, Yui thought that her mother would have wanted this wedding too. The next second, she buried her face in her hands, trying to hide her emotions. Through her sobs, she whispered that even though she was just a clumsy, unworthy girl, she was happy. Then she doubled over, trying to pull herself together to stifle her sobs. Ryuta stared at her with wide eyes and quietly encouraged her to continue. Then Nirvana took her hands away from her face, looked at her childhood friend shyly, and said she agreed, and called him dear to her heart. And so Yui Nirvana changed professions. Before, a 99th level martial arts master. Now, in some incredible way, she was a first-level wife. They had a wedding, both dressed in white, and the whole town celebrated with them. A little bit of happiness was born in the small town of Amizu. After some time, the two of them arrived at the sheer cliff where the restored house stood. Yui exclaimed, "Is this really our new home?" and asked her husband, "Did you really restore her old family home for the two of us?" Ryuta scratched his head awkwardly. He said he'd thought that if they lived here, Yui's parents would rest in peace. At those words, Nirvana gasped, and tears welled up in her eyes. She grabbed her husband's hand tightly and led him into the house, silently promising her parents that she would definitely be happy now. And so, this couple with zero experience finally spent their first night together. Yui was a martial arts master, but she was still a virgin, just like her husband. They sat with their backs to each other, both flushed, staring intently at the floor. Suddenly, Ryuta spun around to face his wife and asked tensely, "How many children do you want?" The girl covered her face with her hands and mumbled that she wanted to give birth to a whole town of his children. The guy froze in shock. A few moments later, the house began to shake with moans and screams. 2 hours later, they were both in the thick of it. Ryuta was breathing heavily and asked his wife if she was okay. Nirvana's hair was tousled, strewn across the sheets. She was flushed, covered her face with her hands, and muttered that she felt like she was dying. What on earth was going on? Could she really die just like this? Her legs, those of a martial arts master, had given out. She thought to herself that she had never in her life known that such a world existed, a world of pleasure. Then again, that was exactly what she'd expected from her husband. As it turned out, Ryuta's combat stats in this area were triple S level. His technique, stamina, attentiveness, and everything else were beyond praise. Yui cried out loudly that she wanted more. She wanted to have a bunch of kids with her husband. The next moment, everything around them began to shake. A bright flash of light illuminated the room. Ryuta and Yui were in bed in the middle of the act when they were literally thrown upward. Both gasped loudly. The girl muttered in confusion that her husband had pushed her too hard. The guy frowned and muttered that that wasn't the issue at all. A few moments later, now fully dressed, they went outside. In the middle of the city, a huge gate studded with stone statues of monsters rose from the ground. The newlyweds approached the fence and exclaimed in amazement together, "What the hell?" Other residents began to emerge nearby. Two guys nearby exchanged surprised glances and asked, "What kind of thing is this that's grown out of the ground?" Ryuta stared at the gate with wide eyes and exclaimed, "Could it really be them?" Yui frowned, clutching the sheet on her shoulders tighter, and muttered, "I just hope it's not what I think it is." Just then, a large glowing sphere appeared in the sky, and a melodious voice rang out. It asked, "Can all the children of the earth hear me?" The voice declared itself to be a goddess. It said that the hero had slain the demon king and brought peace to the land, but this victory had broken an ancient seal, unleashing a hidden labyrinth, the lair of a monster that even the demon king himself feared. The hidden labyrinth now threatens everyone. The goddess urged them to listen to her. They must retrieve the goddess's ring from the deepest depths of the labyrinth, and only then would it be sealed again. The voice began to fade, and the last thing she said was that she believed in their collective strength. As soon as the voice fell silent, the gates began to slowly open, and a wave of monsters and demons poured out from within. Yui Nirvana cried out tensely, pointing ahead. She wrapped her arms tighter around herself and frowned, assessing the threat. A massive black dragon of the 57th level roared, proclaiming that after 1,000 years, it could smell blood again. The Demon King's prison had fallen. A 48th level wyvern echoed this. Now all these lands belonged to them. A 52nd level royal serpent confirmed the dragon's words, addressing it with respect, "Boss." Yui watched all this and thought, high-level monsters, no doubt about it. But they still wouldn't touch her. She gripped something tighter in her hand, already preparing to rush forward. Just then, her husband's voice called out to her, shouting for her to be careful. She hadn't even noticed the huge rock flying toward her. The next second, Ryuta knocked her off her feet with his body, and it was his head that took the blow. They both fell to the ground. Ryuta was unconscious, a bloody stain spreading across the back of his head. The girl pulled him on her lap and cried out into the void. Why had he taken the blow for her? She was a 99th level martial arts master. Damage like that was nothing to her. Yui frowned as she looked at the monsters and thought coldly, "Scoundrels, your time is almost up." The black dragon roared loudly, declaring that there was an entire village before them, enough food for everyone. The royal serpent chimed in joyfully. Now they could eat as many people as they wanted. Just then, Yui Nirvana landed on the ground not far from them. The force of her jump caused the stone beneath her feet to crumble. In one fluid motion, she tied her hair into a high ponytail on the left side. And once again, she became a great warrior. The dragon roared loudly. asking what on earth this person was doing here. The girl paid no attention to this. She held a small pebble in her left hand, stretched her right hand out in front of her, ready to send it flying with a single flick, and calmly told all these monsters to return to the dungeon immediately. Admittedly, her battle aura was somewhat diminished by the light nightgown she was wearing as she stood in the middle of the street. Seeing no reaction, Yui added menacingly that she wouldn't repeat herself. The black dragon widened its eyes, roared loudly that she was a cheeky little human, and that she had no right to talk back. She was nothing but food. As soon as the dragon moved toward the heroine, she flicked a pebble forward, and with a single motion, tore it to pieces. A notification appeared. The dark dragon has been torn to shreds. The dragon's allies stared in astonishment at what was happening, making no attempt to hide their fear. Then Yui took a few steps forward. The stone crunched beneath her feet from the force of her stride. She glared at the monsters and said menacingly that these pathetic little creatures were around level 50 and had to listen to her very carefully. One of her eyes glowed with monstrous power. She picked up another pebble and prepared to fire again. Tilting her head slightly, she muttered emotionlessly that they should all crawl back into their dungeon and not show their faces again, and that they should tell the rest. If they dared to come to the surface, they would answer to her personally. The monsters immediately rushed back into the hidden labyrinth. The gates slammed shut behind them, and cries of apology could be heard from there for a long time. A message appeared. The monsters have returned to the hidden dungeon. The next second, the heroine removed the hairpin from her hair and became a first-level wife again. She muttered that since she'd sorted that out, it was time to go home. A few hours later, Ryuta sat up abruptly in bed. A wet towel was draped over his head. As soon as he sat up, he began frantically calling his wife's name, looking around to see if she was okay. Just then, the girl called out to him. The heroine rushed into his arms with tears in her eyes and began to murmur that thank God he had woken up. Ryuta whispered her name and asked if she was hurt. The girl stepped back slightly, paused for a second, and said with love in her eyes that of course not. After all, he had protected her. Her husband gasped and muttered that he really had protected her. It was a real relief. Yui Nirvana thought to herself, there it is. In the heroic squad, even though she was a martial arts master, they always threw her to the front lines like a tank, right into the thick of battle. But today, her husband had protected her. She caught herself beginning to idealize him in her memories. He had always protected her like a delicate flower blooming in the wild. The next second, she pressed herself tightly against him and murmured that she was so glad she had become Ryuta's wife. The guy blushed deeply. They both tenderly called each other by name and looked into each other's eyes. And they kissed. The heroine made a decision. Ryuta must never find out that she is a 99th level martial arts master. She would remain his beloved, sweet wife. With a sigh of relief, she closed her eyes, and she thought that since the monsters had been driven back into the dungeon, there was nothing left to worry about, and by tomorrow everything would be back to normal. The next day, overnight, the goddess's decree had transformed a quiet, remote fishing port into the world's premier adventure destination. Merchants and entrepreneurs, gripped by gold fever, poured in. People, money, noise, and bustle, all of it swept over the small town at once. The underworld swallowed Imizu. The town became a staging ground for the conquest of the hidden labyrinth. When Yui Nirvana went for a walk along the coast the next morning, she looked around in surprise and confusion. Where had all these people come from? Adventurers crowded the pier, muttering something about the dungeon the goddess had spoken of. Thieves were lurking among them, sizing up how they might make a quick buck here. And, of course, a major trading company had already appeared, confident it would strike it rich here. The main character watched it all with wide eyes and thought, what a mess. Her quiet Imizu had been taken over by foolish adventurers. Just like that heroic squad she'd been part of only a few months ago. She gritted her teeth. Her slim chance at a peaceful life had crumbled to dust. Her quiet happiness with Ryuta was quietly slipping away. That evening, she returned home and froze in shock. Her husband stood there in armor, sword in hand, helmet on his head, a backpack full of gear beside him. He smiled at his wife and muttered a welcome home. The heroine gasped aloud. What on earth was he wearing? And so Ryuta became a first-level adventurer. He frowned slightly, and he quietly explained he'd gone fishing that morning. But due to the influx of adventurers at the port, the price of all supplies had plummeted. Everything around had become unbearable, and he would have to forget about fishing. Yui gasped loudly and muttered that it couldn't be. Had they really ruined even fishing? Her husband continued, staring into the candle flame without turning to his wife. That was exactly why he had become an adventurer. He wants to conquer the hidden dungeon as soon as possible. By clearing it out, he'll restore peace to the city, restore the place where Yui's parents rest. He vowed fiercely that he would bring back their life together in their hometown. At these words, the girl blushed deeply, as if she'd been struck. She gasped to herself and thought that her best friend from childhood always put her first. She closed her eyes and thought how glad she was to have married this man. The next second, she frowned, and she made a decision she would go too. After a while, they were both walking through the corridors of the first floor of the hidden underground. The guy stayed slightly ahead, listening intently. He asked, slightly worried, if his wife had heard anything strange behind them. Yui rolled her eyes and muttered, yes, of course she had. There was a level 42 orc back there, which her husband, of course, shouldn't know about. Ryuta spun around abruptly and said loudly that there was definitely something there. In a split second it took him to draw his sword and turn around. Yui casually swept her hand backward, and the monster flew so far away that it was no longer visible. Ryuta held his slightly trembling sword out in front of him, and asked in surprise, how could there be nothing there? Yui rushed to her husband and muttered, don't scare me like that, hugging him tightly. They took each other's hands and continued on their way. Ryuta said everything was fine. He would definitely protect her. The heroine paused, then murmured lovingly that her husband was so cool. She thought to herself, she would be his beloved, sweet little wife as long as the secret remained a secret, while she herself would watch over her husband from the shadows. And so began the honeymoon in the dungeon for this mismatched couple. About a week after the hidden dungeon appeared, a certain rumor began to spread among the adventurers. In one of the bars, a man sat with a mug of beer and called out loudly to his companions. Had they heard about those guys who'd returned from reconnaissance? His companion immediately pricked up his ears and asked him to spill the beans. The man nodded, but said the condition was a mug of ale. The second frowned intently, muttered that the other was a cheapskate, but agreed anyway. The main character, who was also sitting in the hall, heard this and began to listen intently. The man began to speak. According to rumors, no one had ever made it past the first floor of the dungeon. The staircase leading down, it seemed, simply didn't exist. Yui was standing at the counter, picking up an order, and frowned at those words. She thought she'd known it all along. Even after a whole day of searching with her husband, she, a 99th level martial arts master, hadn't found the lower levels. It couldn't get any worse. Although this was pretty much how she had imagined the hidden dungeon, and it looked like saving the city wasn't going to be easy at all. The girl returned to the table and sat down, still looking tense. Ryuta turned to her and asked if everything was all right. If she wasn't hungry, they could call it a night. The girl immediately looked at her husband with love, shook her head, and cheerfully said she was fine. Ryuta nodded and said he was glad to hear it. He scooped up a spoonful of soup and held it out to his wife. With a warm smile, he said that today they would give it their all again. The heroine suddenly realized this was a classic move. When a guy feeds a girl with a spoon, it's a legendary marital ritual. Yui happily opened her mouth, swallowed the soup, and thought it was pure bliss. She said aloud that it was very tasty. Ryuta replied lovingly that he was glad she liked it. After a while, they finished and headed for the dungeon. On the way, 3 bandits spotted them. One, clearly the leader, an older shadow brother of the 29th level, casually played with a knife and muttered that here were some fresh-faced adventurers who had wandered into the wrong place. He clicked his tongue and added that these suckers were popping up like mushrooms after rain, as soon as a new dungeon opened. The attention of all 3 was drawn to a strange couple who were walking toward the dungeon very enthusiastically, holding hands. The older shadow brother continued, saying that this girl was a rare drop and would be very good, and that she was the perfect first catch. The other 2 chimed in. The second shadow brother bared his teeth and muttered that he'd be very happy to take her. The youngest nodded. His mouth was watering at the thought. The older one nodded. It was time to hunt. The next moment, they were already gone. Hunters of adventurers, bandits who appear every time a new dungeon opens. They steal equipment and supplies from honest explorers and sell them on the black market. The most famous among them are the trio of Shadow Brothers. They are unusual thieves, masterclass assassins. Even experienced adventurers stand no chance against their ambushes from shadows. Meanwhile, Yui and Ryuta were in the dungeon. Ryuta was drawing a map and killing bugs along the way, while Yui pretended to be terrified of them and clung tightly to her husband. To herself, she thought she was literally melting whenever Ryuta fought the bugs. A dark spot on the floor followed the couple, remaining unnoticed, or at least that's what they thought. They were hunters of adventurers, using the assassin skill, Shadow Dive. The second Shadow brother suggested they gut these little darlings right away. They were really getting on his nerves. The elder asked him to wait and be patient. Then, in a deep voice, he said that a true lion hunts even rabbits with full force, and ordered his brothers to stay alert and act just like on their last job. The second one bared his teeth and nodded casually, muttering that he'd drive a knife into this slowpoke's side and then take care of his girl. The third shadow brother blushed at these thoughts, began to breathe heavily, clearly aroused, and started muttering something about a woman, pain, and play. The eldest shadow brother, clearly tired of both of them, said that enough chatter. It was time to get down to business. He licked his bony fingers and muttered that he was going to get a real kick out of all this. The shadows slowly approached the couple. All three believed they were creatures of darkness. They had never been heroes saving the world. But their supreme technique thrives in the darkness. Human or monster, they'll all fall before this blade. In the next second, all three stepped out of the shadows on the floor and unleashed the assassin's secret technique, the Dark Triad. Before they could take a single step, Yui lunged backward with a lightning-fast movement that was impossible to track and managed to strike each of them on the neck, precisely, without any unnecessary movements, stunning all three at once. Yui had used a cloning technique. The blow severely disoriented all three. They were on the verge of losing consciousness. Their bodies wouldn't obey them, and the ground was slipping from under their feet. The eldest shadow brother couldn't wrap his mind around what had just happened. His head was spinning, and everything was blurring before his eyes. Just a second ago, they had been invincible shadows, masters of their craft, and now they lay on the cold dungeon floor, unable to move. The heroine returned to her place, completely unnoticed. Then she spun around sharply to face the shadow brothers and, frowning with a menacing glint in her eyes, coldly declared that the next time she saw their faces, they'd all die, with their genitals shoved up their own asses. The adventure hunters' eyes widened, and they collapsed to their knees. And they began to tremble with fear, scrambling to offer apologies, interrupting one another, and stumbling over their words. And so, on that day, the legendary trio of shadow brothers, fearsome hunters feared by the entire land, retired after a single phrase spoken in a calm voice by a woman in a nightgown. Ryuta hadn't noticed any of what was happening. He walked ahead with a smile, looking straight ahead, lost in his own thoughts. Then he turned to the main character and asked if she was tired. He suggested they grab a bite to eat and haul ahead. Yui skipped over to her husband and happily agreed. As soon as the guy turned away again, she frowned and glanced back out of the corner of her eye, toward the spot where she'd just neatly dealt with the hunters. She couldn't believe that such scum had even made it to their quiet town. She needed to put an end to all this as soon as possible and return to her peaceful, loving life with Ryuta, to spoon-fed soup and walks along the coast. Suddenly, right in front of them, a fearsome 51st-level Cerberus emerged from the darkness of the corridor. The couple froze instantly. The monster was enormous, pitch black, with 3 heads and fangs nearly as long as a human arm, each one. Saliva dripped from its half-open jaws, its eyes burned red, and its growl echoed off the stone walls as a low, vibrating rumble. The heroine frowned and wondered, how on earth had she gotten herself into this? The dungeon works differently than the outside world. Sometimes it forcibly drags adventurers in a battle with monsters, whether they want it or not. She'd been foolish. She'd closed the distance just as she was preoccupied with thoughts of the hunters and completely out of touch with her surroundings. That's just how it is in this hidden dungeon. It doesn't forgive mistakes. Yui assessed the monster with a bored look and thought that, although it possessed decent strength, if she took it seriously, she could handle it with ease. But then Ryuta's face flashed into her mind again. Her husband had turned pale, but he didn't back down a single step. He thrust his sword and shield forward, and he prepared to defend his wife, making it clear with his entire demeanor that he wouldn't let her be taken alive. Then the girl remembered what had happened just recently, how Ryuta had promised to protect her from now on and forever, how he had blushed as he spoke those words. She thought she had already received more love than she deserved, and that if her husband ever found out about her true power, it would destroy everything. Ryuta snapped her out of her thoughts with a loud shout, telling her to hold on to him. The girl gazed lovingly at his back. He was standing between her and danger once again. The next second, there was a deafening crash, and Cerberus's jaws were just a few centimeters from the boy. The monster had leaped with monstrous speed. The heroine cursed under her breath. She'd been distracted by that warm feeling that invariably came from her husband's words, and she was half a second too late to react. She clenched her fist tightly and thought that she was about to smear that Cerberus across the wall in a thin layer. The next second, she sensed someone's presence, sharp, strong, unfamiliar. A loud female voice rang out, confident and clear, commanding the sacred sword Bamong to awaken. The blade flashed with a bright light, flooding the entire corridor. And in the next instant, The girl with the sword used the technique of the thunderous sacred emperor. With a single sweeping stroke, she sliced the monster clean in half, as cleanly as if she were cutting through air. The Cerberus's carcass collapsed on either side of her. Yui gasped inwardly and widened her eyes. She quietly asked herself, what kind of skill was this anyway? She had never seen anything like it before. Ryuta, standing next to her, gasped as well, unable to utter a word. The girl standing on the monster's carcass calmly and matter-of-factly asked if any civilians had been hurt. Noticing that everything was fine, she gave a brief nod. She was a statuesque, fair-haired girl in form-fitting bikini armor, with a massive two-handed sword on her back and an imposing figure that the armor didn't really hide. Yui frowned slightly and sized her up carefully. A warrior, and clearly of an advanced class. A holy knight? No, a paladin, judging by her aura and technique. Ryuta murmured enthusiastically that the savior was incredibly strong. At these words, the heroine frowned even more, glanced at her husband, and snorted to herself. She was much stronger herself, by the way. The paladin girl also snorted dismissively and said she was just an apprentice. Only level 51, nothing special. Ryuta's eyes widened in surprise, and he exclaimed loudly that it was simply amazing. Level 51. That was unbelievable. Yui, standing next to him, slowly clenched her hands into fists and quietly asked why he was saying that. The paladin girl blushed to her ears and muttered that he was making her feel shy. Then Ryuta asked the knight her name. The girl straightened up slightly, struck a proud pose, and said that her name didn't deserve a separate introduction, but it would be rude not to introduce herself at all. She is a member of the Royal Guard, Vice Commander of the Silver Wing Order, Draco Vermilion. Ryuta grinned widely and looked absolutely thrilled. He'd encountered a real royal knight, and a level 51 one at that, right here in the dungeon. Just behind him, Yui muttered mockingly under her breath that knights were cowards who had skipped the battle with the Demon King and only showed up now, when it was all over. Meanwhile, Ryuta continued to praise Draco. Level 51. It was simply unbelievable. He'd never seen anything like it in his life. She blushed even more and said she was still completely unworthy of such praise. Ryuta gasped and began to speculate aloud that a female knight like her could probably even defeat the Demon King himself. Draco replied that if she had the chance, she would gladly test her strength against him. As all this was going on, Yui clenched her fists tighter and tighter until her knuckles turned white. Then Ryuta finally turned to his wife and asked for her opinion. The girl immediately, with noticeable effort, stretched out the most radiant smile she was capable of, and she raised her hands, her whole demeanor expressing complete delight and enthusiastic approval. Draco casually waved her hand in response and said that fine, there really was nothing special about it. The main character thought, exactly, absolutely nothing special. She herself was a 99th level character, unlike some who stood there blushing at the compliments. Some time ago, in the heart of the royal capital, a herald solemnly announced a special mission. His Majesty, despite the defeat of the Demon King, feared that the people would once again be plunged into chaos due to the appearance of a hidden dungeon. That is precisely why Draco Vermilion, Vice Commander of the Silver Wing Order of the Royal Guard, was tasked with clearing the dungeon as quickly as possible. The girl, kneeling on one knee in a posture of reverence, raised her head. She nodded in agreement, saying that it would be as the king wished. This was the story the girl told her new acquaintances, the novice adventurers Ryuta and Yui. The guy turned to his wife and murmured enthusiastically that a royal knight was, after all, really cool. The main character nodded, but thought gloomily to herself. It was, after all, she was the one who had defeated the Demon King, who had terrorized the entire world for many years. And although in reality her true form was a 99th level martial arts master, right now she was playing the role of a sweet little wife, and her husband must never find out the truth. Never. The next second, Ryuta was distracted and asked the female knight if she was here alone. Draco nodded in agreement and explained that her squad couldn't handle the high-level monsters in this hidden dungeon, so she sent them back to the city after they mapped out the floor. Both Yui and Ryuta exchanged surprised glances, and the girl asked if she had really mapped it out already. Draco nodded, but frowned slightly and muttered that despite that, they still hadn't managed to find the staircase to the second floor. The heroine frowned and recalled the rumors from the city. Apparently, no one had yet gone beyond the first floor, and the staircase down seemed to not exist at all. She thought to herself that the hidden dungeon certainly lived up to its name. The next second, Ryuta moved too close to Draco and asked if he could take a look at the map. The girl nodded with a smile, unfolded the sheet of paper, and muttered that she was all thumbs when it came to cartography, so not everything might be clear. At this, the heroine began hopping up and down in indignation, her eyes widening. She exclaimed loudly that they were too close, too close. What on earth were they thinking? Draco looked at her in puzzlement, but said nothing. Her husband remained silent, engrossed in the map. The next second, Ryuta asked, since they were all here anyway, why shouldn't Draco come along with them? The warrior nodded in agreement and said that would be excellent, and she'd be grateful for the company. And so, the paladin Draco officially joined the party. Watching Ryuta stand next to this girl who was showing him the map, Yui grew increasingly gloomy and began silently praying to every god she could think of that this wasn't what she feared, and that this woman's dark class wouldn't turn out to be the woman of easy virtue class. So the three of them continued on their way. Yui walked slightly behind, frowning and silently glaring at the couple in front of her. Ryuta didn't notice a thing. He was studying the map, thoughtfully biting his lip, and suddenly muttered that the layout of this floor looked exactly like the city plan of Amizu. Both girls gasped in surprise, and Draco asked what he meant. The boy continued. The village elder had once told him that long ago, ancient ruins stood where the village now was, with a statue of the demon king towering in the center. Back then, the villagers tore down the statue and built a shrine to the goddess in its place. And that's how the town came to be. Yui gasped in surprise, blushing slightly, and realized she hadn't known this. After all, this was her village too. Then Draco stepped forward and began to reason aloud that the center of this map must surely be that room they'd been unable to find. She slung her sword over her shoulder and looked around. And in the next moment, she lowered her weapon to the ground, knelt on one knee, and said that it was worth testing the goddess's power. As a paladin, she could offer a prayer to her. For a while, Draco prayed in silence. The pair watched her closely, doing nothing. After just a short while, a loud thud and screech echoed off the walls, and a staircase appeared in the floor. The entire room seemed to transform, opening a path downward. All three gasped in amazement. Ryuta turned to his new companion and said that it was simply incredible. The Lady Knight had become the first adventurer to completely clear the first floor of the hidden dungeon. Draco didn't reply, blushing slightly, and asked him to just call her by her first name. She added that it wasn't just her achievement. Ryuta's love for his homeland had also played an important role. That was the key. The two began to whisper quietly to each other, gradually blushing more and more. The heroine watched them with tears in her eyes, misreading the situation. Could it be that Ryuta liked this knightly woman so much, more than he liked her? The next second, her husband called her name. He held out his hand and motioned for her to come forward, thereby pulling her out of her angry thoughts. He muttered that they should reclaim their city, and that this was the first step toward conquering the dungeon. She immediately rushed to him and hugged him tightly, thinking about how much she loved him. Her status as a first-level wife was solemnly restored. Draco watched them with a smile. She blushed slightly, brushed her hair aside with her hand, and muttered that they were so sweetly in love. It was very cute. The main character looked at her in surprise, and she thought, could she actually be normal after all? And so a bond of female solidarity formed between them. The three of them began to descend to the second floor of the dungeon. These labyrinths are teeming with unknown treasures and monsters. And on most floors, there are so-called mid-bosses, guardians blocking the way. The hidden dungeon was no exception. When they descended the stairs, an ambush awaited the party. All three stared in surprise at the enormous monster. It was the mid-boss of the first floor of the hidden dungeon, a level 62 death orc. All three froze in place. Yui thought the ambush was well organized. They really hadn't noticed it. She swung her arm and thought it was time to turn this monster into dust. But in the next second, the orc's massive sword flew toward them. Draco instantly pushed both of her new companions aside and took the full brunt of the blow herself. The main character looked at her in surprise and thought, how on earth did Draco manage to react? And is she really trying to tank a monster that's 11 levels higher than her? An ambush from a level 62, and she's only level 51. That's just suicide. The blow landed on Draco's sword. The girl was slammed hard into the ground, her legs buckling, but she somehow managed to stay on her feet, though she was on the brink of death. It was plain to see. Ryuta lost consciousness from the shock and fell to the ground. The heroine rushed to him. She then turned her gaze to the girl from her squad and thought, Draco certainly wouldn't stand a chance against a level 62 death orc. With an 11-level difference, it was pure suicide. There would be no second chance. Yui shouted loudly, frowning, that they all needed to retreat immediately. The female knight gripped her sword hilt tighter, clinging to her feet with her last ounce of strength. And she shouted back, let him take her husband far away from here, while she herself could still hold off the monster and buy time for their retreat. The main heroine asked in shock, was she really going to die? Given the difference in their levels, she was no match for it. The warrior girl shouted that she was a knight, and that protecting the people was a knight's sacred duty. The kingdom and the adventurers were responsible for themselves, but they were still citizens. And if her body can protect them, she will die with honor. At those words, memories flooded the heroine's mind. Her father had fought monsters in exactly the same way and ordered her to retreat to protect herself. The same face, the same determination in his eyes. The next second, the orc stuck out his huge tongue and began to say that there was a woman in front of him. With a single claw, he pulled forward the clasp on Draco's armor and began breathing heavily, muttering that before he dealt with her, he would definitely have some fun. She would make a good toy. Out of fear, Draco froze in place, tears streaming from her eyes. The claw of the monster's other hand reached for her belt, preparing to pull it off. Draco cried out that she was a knight. Her voice wavered, but did not break. The next second, the claw was stopped by a woman's hand. Yui stood before the monster. The monster stared at the girl in shock. She muttered coldly. So what was he trying to say with that? Mr. Death, orc. Just because she's a woman, does that make her a toy? The next second, she clenched the claw tightly in her palm and crushed it, shattering it into tiny pieces. The monster roared loudly in pain. Yui, at level 1, crushed the Death Orc's finger with no apparent effort. She simply clenched it in her fist as if holding an ordinary pebble. The monster screamed loudly and tried to pull his hand free from her grip, demanding to be let go. Draco watched the scene unfolding before her in shock, and she muttered in disbelief. Could this really be the power of a level 1 wife? Meanwhile, Yui smiled grimly and asked if Mr. Monster had gotten the message. And she asked if he would ever touch the girls again. She squeezed the crushed finger tighter and tighter in her hand, making the blood flow more freely. The orc growled loudly and whimpered, but did not back down. The next second, he jerked his arm back, swung his massive fist, and lunged to strike. Noticing this movement, Yui's hair was ruffled by the gust of wind. She made a lightning-fast, sharp sidestep, effortlessly dodging the blow. And then, with a single kick, she knocked the monster out, shattering the upper half of its body into tiny pieces. Draco, behind her, struggled to her feet, leaning on her sword, and stared in complete shock at what was happening before her. Had the girl just pulverized a level 62 monster with a single blow? The main character didn't even notice the pause, and calmly muttered that she should have listened when she was told to. The female knight recovered from her shock and addressed the main character more loudly. How could an ordinary girl defeat a level 62 Death Orc with a single blow? Who is she anyway? And she cursed in amazement. Yui turned around, panic in her eyes, and began to mumble hurriedly that she was just a housewife, and thanked her a little sheepishly for protecting her husband. Suddenly, it dawned on Draco. She muttered that this power was familiar to her, and immediately gasped. Breathing heavily, staring intently at her savior, she began to mumble. She'd heard that one of the girls from the heroic squad that had defeated the Demon King hadn't shown up in the capital for the celebrations. At these words, the main character blushed deeply and frowned, frantically trying to figure out how to avoid being exposed. Unnoticing this pause, Draco continued. It was a girl nicknamed the Holy Fist worth 1,000, the one who splits the earth and tears the heavens. They said she moved with divine speed, crushing even giants and leaving behind only a flash of lightning. Her name is Yui, a 99th level martial arts master. Nirvana trembled violently, realizing she had been exposed, and she looked at her companion in horror. Draco continued, Yui Nirvana is the absolute pinnacle of martial arts, and if she understood correctly, the very Holy Fist was right in front of her. Then, raising her fist, she added loudly that she had always admired it. The next second, she recoiled, stunned by her own revelation. The main character clutched her head and began to mumble in panic, with tears in her eyes and trembling slightly, that she had been exposed. She really didn't want that. She sank to the floor, pressed her forehead against the cold stone, and covered her head with her hands, muttering that when a girl is called the Holy Fist, it's not nice at all. Not nice at all. Draco looked at her in panic, barely knowing what to do next. A few seconds later, the heroine pulled herself together again and found herself on her knees, cradling her husband's head in her lap. She muttered, slightly embarrassed, that yes, that was pretty much how it was, but now she was just a first-level wife. Draco knelt down beside her, stretched her hand over Ryuta's head, and began to quietly recite a spell. Paladins can use basic healing magic. Muttering the words of healing, she mused that for the sake of love, going from a 99th level martial arts master to a first-level wife. Now everything made sense. But she hadn't expected to meet her spiritual mentor here. in this dungeon. Yui looked up at her sheepishly and asked what she meant. The female knight narrowed her eyes slightly. Then she raised her fist enthusiastically and said, Yui Nirvana. Although she was a woman, she had fought the Demon King with her bare hands and reached the 99th level. She herself is a beacon of hope for every girl on the front lines. At these words, Draco blushed slightly, but looked completely sincere. The main character frowned in shock, staring at the girl. And she thought, is she really talking about me? So someone actually thinks that? Then she said aloud that she asked to keep all of this a secret from her husband. The paladin immediately nodded in agreement with all her devotion and said she gave her word to the master. These words slightly embarrassed the main character. Then Draco clasped her hand slightly and said shyly that she actually had one request. She asked to be taken on as an apprentice and allowed to join the squad. After these words, she dropped to one knee, preparing to take an oath. Overwhelmed by her emotions, tears welled up in her eyes. As a knight and as a woman, she wanted to become stronger, just like her spiritual mentor. The main character frowned slightly, then casually said that no, of course she didn't agree. Draco's eyes widened in shock and asked why. Yui began to explain. She and Ryuta were newlyweds, and why on earth would she need another woman in the squad? Just then, Ryuta himself suddenly came to his senses. In a panic, he started looking around and asked if his wife was okay. Then he noticed a monster's remains right in front of him and asked what happened and how did the orc get defeated. The heroine hesitated slightly and began to mumble something. But then she suddenly came up with an idea. She threw herself into her husband's arms and shouted that she'd been very scared, but Draco had taken care of everything. The paladin stood a little to the side, trying to figure out what on earth was going on. The heroine began to wink at the girl earnestly so she would understand everything. The next second, it dawned on Draco. She chuckled softly, slung her blade over her shoulder, and said that yes, the enemy was strong, but no match for her sacred sword, Bamong. Ryuta hugged his wife tightly and muttered that Miss Draco was simply incredible. She defeated a mid-boss of that caliber. Yui frowned slightly, blushed, and thought, fine, she'd admit that having another girl in the party might actually be useful. She could help protect Ryuta while they explored the dungeon. But on the other hand, having to listen to her husband praise another woman. No, there was no way she would let Draco join them. Meanwhile, the paladin smiled nervously, feeling as though the holy fist was literally piercing her with its gaze. Suddenly, the orc's remains began to vanish right before their eyes, and in their place appeared a large, glowing pentagram. Draco turned around with a smile and said that the portal had opened after all. Then, looking at the bewildered face of her new comrade Ryuta, she explained, the portal was a magic circle for returning to the surface. Once they passed through it, it would become a permanent shortcut between the surface and this place. They could return here at any time. It was also proof that the floor had been completely cleared. Then she pointed to the door with the downward arrow and said that a door to the next floor had appeared, and asked what the group intended to do next. The main character frowned slightly, and with a smile, she said that the answer was obvious. Her husband and the female knight still needed treatment, so they should return to the surface first. Meanwhile, a large glowing sign appeared in the city with an announcement. The first floor of the hidden dungeon had been cleared, the mid-boss Death Orc had been defeated, and the cleanup squad consisted of Ryuta, Yui, and Draco. A little later, in the evening, everyone returned home. Ryuta jumped onto the bed with a smile and murmured blissfully that there's no place like home. It's so cozy. Yui was sitting on the edge of the bed, carefully combing her hair. She called out to her husband by name and asked what he thought of her. Ryuta threw his hands behind his head and asked if she meant Miss Draco. That impressive lady. The main character turned pale and thought in panic. She knew it. Her husband had really fallen in love with that girl. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she lowered her head slightly. Ryuta noticed the change in his wife immediately. He called her by name. With a trembling voice, she said she understood everything. Her husband couldn't take his eyes off the female knight, so it seemed men really were crazy about bikini armor. Ryuta smiled broadly and asked if his wife had really misunderstood things that badly. He then explained that he simply respected Miss Draco as a fellow adventurer. And despite her attempts to object, he asked her not to forget. He had waited for her in this village for 10 years. She's the only one he has eyes for, and he'd never even look at another woman. So Yui could relax. That night, the two of them were overjoyed, and the next day, Draco received permission to join the party. The town of Amizu is now an outpost of the hidden dungeon, a quiet fishing village that has become a magnet for adventurers from all over the world. At the Amizu branch of the guild, an elf girl in uniform sat behind a reception desk. She asked with a smile if she was correct in assuming that Yui and Ryuta were there to register their party. Both nodded and filled out the form. At the moment, there were 3 members of the party: Ryuta Fisherman, Yui Fisherman, and Draco Vermilion. When the protagonist smiled and told Miss Draco that she was now an official member of the party, the girl smiled broadly and assured them she was always at their service. Yui also welcomed the new member. The paladin nodded in agreement and muttered that she was thrilled at the chance to be near a saint. Then she realized she'd almost let something slip and abruptly fell silent mid-sentence. Yui shouted, "Yes, yes, welcome," trying to drown out what had almost slipped out, and with a piercing mental glare, she tried to convey to Draco that things like her former title of Holy Fist must be kept a strict secret from him. Draco laughed awkwardly after hearing this. Ryuta nodded and said with a smile that now they should get ready for the next experiment and head home. Both girls nodded in agreement. A little later, they were already at Yui and Ryuta's house. The 3 of them went up to the 2nd floor. Draco ran to the window of her room and began to look around enthusiastically with wide eyes. She would finally have her own room, and what a gorgeous view from the window. The rooms turned out to be next to each other. The owner of the house smiled and told her not to rush and to get some good rest. Once everyone had gone to their rooms, the main character sat on her bed looking displeased as she packed her backpack, muttering to herself. Even though they were newlyweds, there was now a stranger living in the house. Ryuta was polishing his sword and said with a smile that Miss Draco was an important friend and needed a proper place to rest. Yui blushed slightly and began to mumble, "Well, still, I mean, she's a girl." Ryuta didn't notice any of this and shrugged, saying he didn't know any girl cooler than his own wife. At those words, Yui gasped and fell onto the bed, struck to the core. Noticing this, her husband jumped to the bed, grabbed her by the shoulder, and asked if she was okay. The heroine immediately put her wife's skill to use, the super-loving hold, wrapping her legs around her husband's waist and pulling him toward her. Ryuta called her name in surprise, asking what she wanted. The girl blushed shyly, smoothed her hair, and said that if her husband says he loves only her, he has to prove it. The guy blushed shyly at those words, and then screams and moans began to echo from the room. Draco lay on the bed behind the wall and thought with slight annoyance that the walls in the house were rather thin. The next day, when everyone woke up, Ryuta suggested visiting his parents' grave and introducing Draco to them while they were at it. He'd take care of the housework in the meantime. Yui brushed her hair and smiled, saying she'd help with the chores too. What came of it was unbelievable. She managed to break a plate, rip a shirt while trying to wash it, and spill a full bucket of water on the floor, flooding the entire kitchen. In a panic, the heroine sat down right on the wet floor and thought that she was completely incapable of managing a household, despite the fact that she was technically a first-class wife. Both of her companions immediately rushed to calm her down. Ryuta thanked her for her help, but politely said he'd handle the rest himself. Draco noted that even though she was a klutz, they should go pay their respects to her parents now. Yui muttered with tears in her eyes that they should do just that. After a while, they were walking along the path toward the graves. The main character covered her face with her hands and began muttering in panic that her husband now definitely despised her. The paladin threw her hands behind her head and, in a panic, began assuring her that everything was fine. He still loved her. It was obvious. Yui asked, "Do you really think that's true?" Draco nodded in agreement. And at those words, the heroine began to wipe away her tears, gradually calming down. The warrior girl noticed that the village was indeed very beautiful. No wonder her 2 comrades were so eager to protect it. The heroine looked in the same direction. Blushing slightly, she said that it also helped that this area was less affected by the hidden dungeon than the city itself. At least here, Mom and Dad could sleep peacefully. Suddenly, a familiar elderly voice called out to them. Could it really be little Yui standing before her? Both girls turned around, and they saw their neighbor, Aunt May, a level 48 wife. Draco asked, "Who is she anyway?" The main character immediately explained that when she and Ryuta were kids, Aunt May always looked after them, so she was practically family to them. Aunt May stepped closer, rested her head on the main character's shoulder, and murmured warmly that she was so glad her dear girl had finally come home. The main character chuckled softly, and then they continued on their way together. Aunt May began to tell a story. Even though Yui was a tomboy, she was also a big crybaby. Every time she started bawling, Ryuta would go catch her favorite fish to cheer her up. And now the 2 of them are married, and that makes her immensely happy. Yui nodded in agreement with a tender smile. Aunt May continued. She was sure that Yui's parents would be happy too. Meanwhile, at Yui's parents' graves, a strange man in a dark cloak was standing there. He cast an earth magic spell, and suddenly, the graves began to open. His accomplices appeared immediately. One muttered that, as expected, the village graves hadn't been looted yet. Another laughed and said they'd take everything and not bother anyone. Doyle, the summoner and leader of the Earth Splitter Squad, a 28th level mage, that very man in the black robe, frowned and thought that he had never imagined the hidden dungeon would be so difficult and that their squad would have to retreat right after the first floor. A disaster. Although, at the very least, they needed to earn something for the return trip. Suddenly, Draco approached the tombs. She pointed a finger and demanded menacingly, "What on earth is going on here?" and ordered them to stop immediately. Doyle smiled slightly and muttered, "A female adventurer and 2 housewives." Then he laughed, and he continued that if she was an adventurer, she should understand. His team was hunting for treasure, all by the rules. Aunt May gasped nearby and muttered something in shock about adventurers. It was just awful. The main character remained silent, clenching her hands into fists, her face darkening. Draco began screaming in panic for them to stop and undo the spell. Otherwise, at that, the wizard mockingly cut her off, asking what on earth she meant. Did she really think that a single little adventurer could take on the Earth Splitter Squad all by herself? Then a powerful blow struck him, sending him flying backward. Draco screamed that they were all idiots. She was trying to save their damn lives. The main character appeared from behind her. Her eyes sparkled, her hair blowing in the wind. She said, menacingly and quietly, that she'd had enough. The warrior girl screamed in panic that she should hold back. "You can't kill people." Yui stepped forward. She turned to her friend and muttered that she knew that, of course, and with a gentle smile informed her that she was just going to beat the crap out of them. Just then, the tallest of the thugs approached her. He gasped, placed a hand on her head, and asked what was wrong with this girl. Was she on her period? Why was she so worked up? Was she looking down on them? The next second, he struck her on the side of the head with his other hand, and there was a distinct cracking sound. Just not her bones. The guy frowned and asked, "What the hell just happened?" He trembled violently. Blood spurted from the side of his own hand in all directions. The heroine calmly muttered that it was such a pity. Did second-day adventurers not even drink growing? A former 99th level martial arts master. Her body was as hardened as steel. Doyle thought gloomily that this couldn't be true. How could his subordinate, who had attacked her, have taken the full brunt of his own attack back? The one who took the blow began to shake and collapsed heavily to the ground, his other hand dripping with blood. Doyle wondered, was he actually asleep? The rest of the guys from his squad shouted that the girl in front of them was just an amateur and rushed at her to attack. Doyle stood to the side, eyes wide, watching them. Not a single blow, neither from a sword nor an axe, caused the girl the slightest harm. The bandits began screaming in horror and tried to flee in panic. Yui paid them no attention. She frowned and clenched her hand into a fist, and she slammed her fist into the ground with all her might. Doyle, standing slightly to the side, watched her movements in panic and thought, "What on earth is this woman?" Although he was standing at a distance, the crack in the ground from the blow reached almost his feet. He fell to the ground, began to tremble, turned pale, and muttered that this girl had split the earth with her bare hands. Out of fear, he began to hiccup. The heroine took a few steps toward him with a scowling expression. And then, suddenly, she put on a completely innocent expression and, with all the gentleness and kindness she could muster, asked them to carefully put everything back where it belonged. The bandits, in a panic, immediately rushed to fulfill her request, shouting that of course they would do everything, just so long as they weren't killed. Yui, Draco, and Aunt May stood slightly to the side and watched their actions. And so the cemetery returned to normal. The adventurers who had been trying to make a quick buck scattered. All 3 girls knelt before the graves and began to pray. Then Aunt May noticed that Yui seemed incredibly strong. The girl turned pale at first. Then she blushed and began to mumble hurriedly that it was just a lucky coincidence. Just a coincidence, of course, and looked in panic at her friend, who could confirm all of this. But Draco also turned pale and mentally made it clear that such coincidences don't happen. Aunt May noticed the girls exchanging glances, smiled kindly, and said that her parents were most likely very proud, seeing how strong she had become. The main character lowered her head and frowned, and muttered that she wasn't sweet at all. She was a total mess around the house, and if this kept up, Ryuta would definitely run away from her. She lowered her head, her face darkening. Aunt May looked at the other girl in panic, turned pale herself, and didn't know what to say. Suddenly, Aunt May clapped her hands and noticed that a small box had fallen out of the ground. Any idea what this is? A caption appeared above the box. A rare item, a memento of something unknown. Draco sat up with interest and said it was a mysterious object. Noticing Aunt May's confusion as she held the box in her hands, she explained that in old cemeteries, you sometimes come across amazing things. Rare drops or sacred daggers buried in graves. It's not at all uncommon. May gasped with interest and muttered that it was very interesting. She tried to open the box, but she couldn't get it to budge. She began to mutter. Could their peaceful little Imizu really have been hiding something like this? When nothing worked, she handed the box to the main character and asked why she wouldn't give it a try. Draco leaned in beside her, watching with interest. Yui absent-mindedly took the box in her hands and muttered that it looked familiar. The next second, she opened it with ease, and all three stared inside in shock. Inside lay an old sheet of paper on which was written, Yui's future dream is to become a lovely bride. All three gasped in surprise. Draco asked, is that really Yui's handwriting? And was that really the master's childhood dream? Then she laughed. The main character blushed deeply and remembered. It was way back in her childhood. She had walked up to her best friend and asked what he was doing. Ryuta said that people say if you write down your dream and bury it, it's bound to come true. The girl looked at him with interest and said she'd write one too. The two of them began writing messages to their future selves, rolled up the pieces of paper, put them in a box, and buried them right there. The main character absent-mindedly took her note out of the box and quietly muttered that her dream had come true. Just then, Aunt May noticed that there was another piece of paper in the box. She called out the main character's name. She picked up the second piece of paper, and there was Ryuta's dream written on it. It said that he would definitely marry Yui, give her the goddess's ring, and make her the happiest woman in the world. All three of them gasped in surprise, and the main character blushed all the way to the roots of her hair. Memories began to flood her mind of how Ryuta had always looked out for her when they were children, how he was doing the housework right now, without ever once scolding her for anything. Overwhelmed by her emotions, the main character began to cry. She looked toward her house and whispered, "Thank you for loving me just the way I am all this time." Draco rubbed her chin thoughtfully, and then she suddenly remembered something important. Could it be that the guy had written about the goddess's ring? Yui and Aunt May looked at her in surprise. Asking what was going on, Draco exclaimed, "Isn't the goddess's ring the key item for sealing the hidden dungeon that the goddess herself spoke of?" Yui frowned slightly and remembered. Indeed, that was the case. Aunt May gasped and said, "Didn't she know? After all, it's an ancient legend of their village. The woman who received the goddess's ring would live the happiest life in the world." After hearing this, the heroine rushed home as fast as she could. She flung open the door and called out her husband's name. He was setting plates of food on the table and grunted, asking what was wrong. The girl threw herself into his arms, hugged him tightly, and began to say in a loving voice that she was incredibly happy. She pressed herself closer and closer, closing her eyes tightly. Ryuta frowned slightly, then brightened up and blushed a little, saying that of course he loved her too. Draco followed the main character into the house. She snorted and blushed slightly as she looked at the couple, and she thought that bringing the holy fist of the 99th level to tears was incredible. Mr. Ryuta is truly an outstanding man. And so, the newlywed squad, with fresh feelings in their hearts, set off to conquer the second floor. Meanwhile, on one of the ships approaching the city, a girl in a wide witch's hat gasped with joy and said that she could finally see the gates. She had returned home to her native Imizu. While she had been studying at magic school for 3 months, a dungeon had appeared in her village. She couldn't possibly miss that. Then her voice softened, and she looked up at the sky, and she said she couldn't wait to meet her fiancé, Ryuta. The hidden dungeon, second floor. Adventurers challenging the dungeon faced a new, insurmountable obstacle. Everyone who had been there exclaimed in anger. What kind of mid-boss was this anyway? Their swords were useless. They broke and crumbled. The unique feature of this boss is complete physical invulnerability. Several adventurers perished this way, never figuring out how to fight it. Sometime later, the main character and Aunt May were sitting at a small table under a tree, eating leisurely. Draco stood near the tree and muttered tensely that the second floor of the hidden dungeon had already been dubbed the Adventurer's Killer. Seeing that no one was paying any attention to her words, she leaned forward slightly and slammed her fist disapprovingly into the air. The main character, Yui, munched on her food and muttered that it was incredibly delicious and that she really wanted Ryuta to try some too. May, the neighbor, a level 48 wife who had cooked all of this, kindly said that, of course, he could have as much as he wanted. Seeing that no one was paying any attention to her, Draco leaned forward even more and called out to her master, folding her arms across her chest. The main character took a bite of an orange with a spoon and asked, "So what does she want?" Can't she see that the main character is in the middle of a housewife's afternoon fruit party right now? Draco said this was far more important than their party. The squad had serious problems. They were a purely physical attack squad, and with a boss who was completely physically invulnerable, they didn't stand a chance. Yui paid not the slightest attention to her reasoning, casually telling her to relax and put her worries aside. The main character moaned blissfully with pleasure, chewing on a piece of fruit. Aunt May sat nearby, took a sip of juice, and nodded in agreement that she was right. Draco snorted in displeasure and turned away from them. The next second, a loud noise rang out. Aunt May pressed her palm to her forehead, looked closely, and asked, "What's going on over there? Could it be their neighbor, Mr. Gom?" Draco looked ahead, slightly bewildered, while Yui frowned and gripped her cup tighter. Following the man, a furious level 32 boar came into view. The man in front was struggling to break free from it and was shouting that a stray monster had appeared on his field. The boar was truly terrifying, a massive carcass covered in stiff black bristles, each step shaking the ground, bloodshot eyes, tusks as thick as an adult man's arm, sharp as a blade. It charged forward at monstrous speed, sweeping everything aside in its path. The ground trembled under its weight, and hot steam burst from its nostrils. Mr. Gom ran for his life, not paying attention to the path, gasping for breath and stumbling, while the monster inexorably closed in on him, shortening the distance with every leap. Just a little more, and those enormous tusks would have reached the fugitive. Aunt May covered her mouth with her hand and called out to Yui, saying that this was surely another side effect of the hidden dungeon. The heroine stood up, continuing to calmly eat her fruit, waved her hand, and counted aloud. Wind speed 3, northeast. Both girls watched her intently. The heroine continued, distance about 800. She chewed thoroughly, and she spit out the pit neatly. In the same way, on the first level, she shot a fruit pit straight through the monster's head. It fell immediately, immobilized. The man, who had collapsed to the ground in fear, began screaming that the monster's head had simply cracked. How on earth could that have happened? Draco, watching the whole scene in shock, thought Yui had simply split the monster's skull open with a fruit pit. There she was, the real former Holy Fist, the former 99th level martial arts master. The heroine carefully wiped her mouth with a handkerchief. Aunt May gathered all the remaining fruit into a basket, waved goodbye with a broad smile, and wished them luck. When the two girls also stood up and said it was time for them to head to the hidden dungeon, everyone went their separate ways. The girls headed toward the house. The young paladin walked slightly behind and muttered discontentedly that now she understood why her masters weren't bothered by mid-bosses. The main character walked slightly ahead and muttered thoughtlessly that maybe they did need a mage in the party after all. She added to herself that she hated mages with all her heart. After all, back when she was a member of a heroic squad, her comrade always shot fire and completely ignored her. All he did was burn everything around him. Meanwhile, at the port of Amizu, a fair-haired girl in a witch's hat waved her hands and muttered that she had finally made it. There it was, her quiet little Amizu. She looked around and muttered in shock that even in the capital, at the Magic Academy, there weren't this many adventurers. Then she tugged on the little finger of one hand, to which a small thread was tied, and asked, "Where's her fiancé?" The string rose and pointed in a direction. The girl chuckled quietly and asked herself, "I wonder if Ryuta will be very surprised when his sweet little bride returns after 3 months away." Meanwhile, at Yui and Ryuta's house, the main character walked into the house and told her husband she was back. He asked if she wanted to have dinner first, or take a bath first. The girl pressed her palms to her chest and blushed, and she mumbled that she would like to. The guy asked again, what did she mean? Then Yui said what she meant, or rather, herself as the choice, flirting slightly and smiling. Draco stood slightly to the side and watched the scene intently, muttering to herself, so much for the former Holy Fist. Suddenly, she seemed to sense someone's presence. She turned around and saw a girl in a pointed hat pressed tightly against the window, trying to peer inside. Startled, the paladin took a few steps back. Yui and Ryuta turned around too, even though they'd clearly been about to indulge in a completely different activity just a moment ago. The girl in the hat whispered, "Fire magic. Divine red fire," and she fired straight into the wall, blowing half the wall away and cutting a wide passage through the house. Draco barely managed to jump out of the way, while Yui instinctively shielded Ryuta with her body so he wouldn't get hurt, and asked, "What the hell is going on?" Then, the girl in the pointed hat walked through the opening and casually said she was finally home, addressing the boy by a pet name. It was Juju Anaheim, a 19-year-old student at the Magic Academy, a mage. Yui's eyes widened in shock, and she asked, "Who is this girl? And what on earth is she doing here?" Ryuta turned around and his eyes widened, calling her by name. The girl immediately threw herself into his arms, exclaiming that they hadn't seen each other in a long time, and they began to argue over who had missed the other more. The main character stood slightly to the side and thought in shock, what on earth is going on? Who is this skinny weirdo? And what is her husband even doing here? Then Ryuta said that of course he had missed Juju too. At those words, the main character turned pale and power began to radiate from her in all directions. The air around her literally trembled. Draco behind her started waving her arms, trying to calm her down with gestures. Ryuta gasped, and Juju smirked, hugging him tighter around the neck. Yui asked in a panic, "Who is this girl?" Juju pressed herself even closer to the guy and said that she was the one who should be asking. Who was this woman in their house? Ryuta gasped, smiled, and said that they hadn't met yet. He waved his hand and offered to introduce her. The girl in the pointed hat was Juju Anaheim, his little sister, or something like that. Then he stepped toward his wife and introduced her. This was his beloved wife. Juju's face darkened, and a look of confusion and shock appeared on her face. In a panic, she started screaming, "His wife? His wife? And she's just his little sister?" In her mind, she drifted back into her memories. 10 years ago in the city of Amizu, after Yui Nirvana had sailed off to defeat the Demon King, a little girl was washed ashore. Juju Anaheim, the sole survivor after monsters attacked the ship on which she and her parents were sailing. She sat on the pier almost every day and cried, not knowing what to do or where to go. One day, Ryuta happened to be nearby. He asked her why she was always crying there. Then he continued, asking if she knew that he didn't have parents either. His girlfriend had lost her father because of the monsters. But then she gathered her strength and left town, and all he could do was watch her go. After hearing this, the girl stopped crying and looked at the boy with interest. He picked up his bag and started walking toward the city, saying one last thing. If she ever got into trouble, she should just let him know. She could consider him family, as if he were her older brother. The girl wrapped her arms tighter around her knees. She watched him walk away and whispered the word family. For her, family was synonymous with marriage. Such was the firm conviction of Juju, who was always prone to misunderstandings of this sort. Returning to the present, she thought gloomily. And yet, while she was at the Magic Academy training to become the perfect bride, had this MILF Yui gotten in her way? Ryuta said aloud that she'd returned just in time. They needed magical support for the second floor of the hidden dungeon, so welcome to the family. Standing beside him was a completely calm and serene Yui. Folding her hands in front of her, she asked with a gentle smile if she would help them. Juju thought gloomily. Going on an adventure with this girl? She'd rather die. Suddenly, it dawned on her. If she joined the group, that meant she could stay close and get rid of her when the time was right. Not noticing the change in the girl, Yui approached her and said, "If she's her husband's younger sister, then she's my younger sister too, and I'm very pleased to meet you." The girl gave a grim smile and agreed in a sinister voice, "Fine, big sister." She added to herself that for her older brother's sake, she would definitely kill this woman. And so Juju joined their party. The group of adventurers set off for the gates of the hidden dungeon. All four stopped right in front of them. Juju stood slightly ahead and gazed at the gates with undisguised admiration, muttering, "So this is what a hidden dungeon looks like." Yui looked at her tenderly and said that they were all counting on her help. The girl hunched over and grimaced very grimly. The main heroine giggled quietly and added that she and Ryuta had cleared the first floor with the power of love, so now their group could go through the portal straight to the second floor. Laughing, she covered her mouth with her hand. Juju's face darkened, and she muttered, "Yeah, right, of course, that's exactly what they did." Just then, the remaining members of the squad approached them. Ryuta turned to Juju and said that his wife was very gentle, while Miss Draco was strong, so there was nothing to worry about. At these words, the young paladin covered her eyes in embarrassment and scratched her head with her hand. Then she composed herself and said that she'd heard the boss on the second floor was completely immune to physical attacks, so she was counting on Juju's magic too. She looked at the girl with great confidence. Then the main character spoke up again, saying admiringly that Juju's fire magic was simply incredible. She waved her hand gloomily and whispered her thanks, mockingly calling her little sister. She thought to herself, she, the mage Juju Anaheim, had mastered two types of magic: fire magic, which she had already demonstrated, and the sinister art that brought death through status ailments, poison magic. She watched as her beloved Ryuta and the hated Yui held hands and walked forward. She thought furiously. Her brother was her family. He was her fiancé. And this Yui, a first-class wife, this cow had simply stolen her Ryuta. She smiled even more darkly and, with a mad gleam in her eyes, thought that she would definitely kill her. The next moment, the portal to the second floor of the hidden dungeon opened. All four of them stepped inside. They looked around in awe. Everything around them sparkled. It was incredibly beautiful. Magical crystals covered the walls like a continuous shimmering carpet, causing them to glow with a soft, cool light, creating the sensation of walking through a living gemstone. Draco said, "This is what it's like. The second floor is completely different, much prettier than the first." Ryuta nodded in agreement and muttered that the ore glowed like city lights. Yui was also looking around in awe, unable to hide her amazement. Then Juju turned to her and asked, "Isn't it beautiful?" calling her little sister. She grabbed the main character's hand and looked at her with innocent eyes. The main character turned to the girl and said that yes, it really was very beautiful. Juju's face darkened, and she thought ominously her opponent had let her guard down. She squeezed the girl's hand and cast a poison spell, a poisonous touch, and so Yui was struck by a deadly poison. The heroine stared ahead in shock, not understanding what was happening. She blushed deeply, began to breathe heavily, and muttered that she felt hot. Juju thought that everything had gone according to plan. Even a dragon would die in a minute, which meant Nirvana had only seconds left to live. So they took a few steps forward. Juju smirked to herself, hiding her face under her hat. The main character was breathing heavily, and that caught the girl's attention. The girl looked at her with mixed feelings. Yui began to breathe steadily, changing her rhythm, and in the next second, she exhaled deeply. Juju, shocked and amazed, asked herself, could the poisoning really be gone? It was an advanced skill of a martial arts master, unwavering breathing. By circulating energy throughout the body using masterful breathing techniques, one can heal chronic ailments. Noticing that his wife had felt unwell for a moment, Ryuta immediately approached her and asked how she was. The girl took his arm and said that everything was fine now and they could move on. Juju thought to herself, what on earth is wrong with this woman? How could something like this even happen? Suddenly, monsters appeared from around the corner. A crystal fish and a metal jellyfish. Draco drew her sword and prepared to attack. She swung her sword and realized it all made sense. These were mineral monsters, magical creatures resistant to physical attacks. She turned to Juju and said she needed her support. Somewhere behind them, Yui was screaming that she was terrified, clearly flirting with her husband, while he held his shield and sword in front of him and told her to stay behind. Juju gripped her staff tighter in her hands, thinking grimly that this cow had finally gotten on her nerves. The next second, she unleashed her fire magic, and Draco became the mage's shield, deflecting all the monster's attacks. Juju thought angrily that behind her, her beloved brother was protecting that girl who wasn't even fighting. This was her second chance. She cast a poison spell, a toxic mist, a deadly fog that brought death with a single breath. Yui neutralized the poison again, which greatly shocked Juju. This repeated over and over. A monster would appear, Juju's magic would defeat the monster. Then Juju would use poison magic, and Yui would neutralize the poison. This cycle repeated many times, yielding no result. After a while, the girl began leaning heavily on her staff, covered in sweat and breathing heavily. She cursed under her breath. Her mana was nearly depleted from the fighting and endless failed attempts at poisoning. Draco didn't notice this setback. She turned to her partner and said that she had impressive skills. With abilities like that, they were sure to clear the second floor as well. The newlyweds continued to coo to each other, oblivious to their surroundings. This made Juju shout furiously that she'd had enough. The whole group stopped a few meters in front of a door chained shut. One of them whispered that this door clearly smelled of trouble. Draco stepped forward and said that the mid-boss of this floor was most likely waiting on the other side. Yui turned to Juju and asked how she was feeling. Then she suggested they go back and rest for a bit, even though Juju was bright red and struggling to breathe. She thought that this woman hadn't lifted a finger, forcing Madame Draco to waste her energy and exhaust herself while she just stood there idly by. She didn't even have a conscience. She didn't want to die from the poison. Noticing how much the girl's spirits were starting to sink and how angry she clearly looked, Yui called her by name and gently asked if she'd said something wrong. Juju shouted that everything was just wonderful. Couldn't she see that? Could some pathetic mid-boss really do anything to her? She'd just wipe him out with her magic. The next second, the girl bolted for the doors. Ryuta tried to stop her, but he was too late. Suddenly, the chain snapped on their own. Juju whispered that the door had opened on its own and gasped, looking up. Could the door really be the monster's mouth? And then, in all its monstrous splendor, the second floor mid-boss appeared before them. A level 71 metal skull, huge, like an entire house, with empty, dark eye sockets from which live snakes stretched out, writhing and hissing in all directions. The skull itself was covered in metal plates fused with the bone into a single impenetrable armor. The lower jaw hung open in a terrifying gaping hole, revealing the endless darkness within. Attached to the skull was a massive skeleton, its bones metallized its joints creaking like rusted armor, and with every movement, the dungeon floor shook. It was a monster that inspired true primal fear. Not just powerful, but repulsive, hideous, created by darkness itself. Juju froze in confusion, completely unable to do anything. Suddenly, Draco leapt right in front of her, drew her sword, and cast the lightning blade spell, stopping the monster's arm. The next second, they both jumped aside. The paladin cursed under her breath. Just as the rumors said, physical attacks had no effect on this monster at all. Her sword was covered in nicks and cracks from that single touch. Juju peeked out from under her hat and muttered for the lady to step aside. Draco looked at her and was indignant. What kind of lady was she? She was only 21 years old. Juju didn't listen. She shouted that she would definitely show her brother her true, badass side. And she cast the full mana charge spell. She began casting the death spell. The yellow gem glowed. The double dragon head opened its gates, and an explosive flame burst forth. From this entire arsenal, the final fire appeared, which she unleashed directly at the monster with a maximum force she was capable of. Surprisingly, but magic didn't work on the metal skull either. No damage, not even the slightest. Juju realized that nothing had worked and slowly sank to her knees. She watched the fire splattering in all directions, causing the monster not the slightest harm. Tears began to well up in her eyes, and she started muttering. She tried so hard. Why was everything like this? Why wasn't anything working? Yui stood a little to the side and thought. This monster is completely invulnerable to both physical and magical attacks. She frowned resolutely, but she already knew how to defeat it. Juju froze in confusion before the enormous skull, which had bared its jaws and was preparing to devour the girl. To herself, she apologized to her brother. To be disgraced like this, barely having had a chance to truly fight, was unbearable. Just then, Ryuta rushed over to her, shouted for her to take cover, and shielded her with his body from the sudden blow. So Ryuta was knocked unconscious again and fell to the ground. Juju immediately rushed to him, called his name, and tried to wake him, completely oblivious to everything around her. Suddenly, Yui leapt right in front of them, and with a single sweeping motion of her arm, she sent the monster flying several meters backward with a powerful blow, cutting off its attack before it could be completed. Holding her arm out in front of her, she muttered to her beloved husband that he really had to forgive her. Even though she had anticipated the monster's move, she hadn't been able to suppress the urge to protect Juju. So now she had completely failed in her role as his wife. Juju looked at the girl in shock, tears welling up in her eyes. And with a trembling voice, she asked, who was she anyway? Yui turned to her and said gently, as soon as she finished off this monster, Juju would call her big sister. Just then, the monster appeared beside them again. The metal skull cackled hideously. Its voice boomed like a hammer striking an anvil, and it ominously declared that no blows would work. Draco ran up next, barely recovered, out of breath, and muttered that it couldn't be true that the fists of a 99th level martial arts master would be useless. The metal skull possessed a special trait, a supermetallic body that completely neutralized all physical and magical attacks. But there was still one type of attack that worked even against metal monsters. She struck the monster again. The heroine saw that a critical hit had landed. She slowly lowered her slightly trembling hand and muttered that she really didn't like this feeling. It wasn't pleasant at all. A critical hit is a special attack that sometimes occurs in physical combat, completely ignoring the enemy's defense and dealing a maximum of 999 damage. The standard base probability is 1 in 64. But that's not the limit. The martial arts master class has an ability that increases this probability proportionally to the level. The probability is equal to the level divided by 256. For Yui, a 99th level martial arts master, the chance of a critical hit was 99 out of 256. This meant that nearly 40% of her attacks counted as critical hits. That was precisely why metal monsters possessed such powerful defense. They usually had very little health, and critical hits were the only truly effective way to defeat them. The heroine calmly stared at the monster, showing no emotion. The enormous skull opened its jaws wide, its empty eye sockets glinting, and it whispered ominously that a critical hit meant nothing. It had 100,000 health points. The next second, it prepared to attack. To herself, the heroine thought that they were in a hidden dungeon, and this was no ordinary monster. Draco fell to her knees, and she thought with horror that the mid-boss in front of them had 100,000 HP, and it was metallic. The maximum critical damage was 999 HP, even with her master's 40% critical chance. How on earth could they possibly defeat something like this? The next second, the main character, Yui Nirvana used her ultimate skill, Divine Fist 1,000 Strikes. The technique unleashed 1,000 strikes in 10 seconds. And as explained earlier, critical hits occurred with a probability of 99 out of 256. This meant that 38.7 critical hits per second rained down on the metal skull. Yui's fists turned into blurry shadows. Their movement was too fast for the eye to follow, and the air around her hands tore apart from the speed with a deafening whistle. Each critical strike was accompanied by a flash of blinding light and a dull rumble that shook the walls of the dungeon. The monster's metal body began to crack, first with thin webs of cracks spreading across the metal armor. Then chunks began to chip off and fly in all directions. The lower jaw flew off first, followed by plates of armor. The skeleton's bones scattered like splinters. In a matter of seconds, the enormous, seemingly invincible monster crumbled into pieces, leaving behind only a pile of metal debris on the dungeon floor, slowly settling amid clouds of dust. Yui glanced over her shoulder at the spot where the monster had been standing just a second ago, and noted with a slight smile that only 2.5 seconds had passed. All things considered, it had lasted that long. Not bad for a mid-boss in a hidden dungeon. Draco looked up in shock and gazed at her master with awe. She realized she hadn't fully appreciated her strength until now. Killing a metal skull in 2.5 seconds, one that was invulnerable to both physical and magical attacks, seemed unimaginable. And the stronger the monster they faced, the more it struck her just how boundless her master's power was. Then Draco noticed that Juju was sitting on the floor, trembling. She quickly ran over to her and asked if she was okay. The girl looked at her in shock, and with her eyes wide open, she asked, "Is that woman even human?" referring to Yui. Draco blushed slightly and said that she was her master, a 99th level martial arts master, known as the Holy Fist of the heroic squad that defeated the Demon King. Juju's eyes widened even more, though it seemed that was already impossible. She gasped and asked again, "Is it really the 99th level?" Then she dropped to her knees and started screaming that no, that couldn't be true. Draco folded her arms across her chest smugly, snorted, and muttered that she'd finally realized just how incredible her master was. Just then, Yui approached her and grumbled discontentedly that, in reality, she was just a sweet little wife right now, and certainly no martial arts master. Juju, unable to control her tongue, shouted. It was no surprise that her most potent poison hadn't affected the main character. This was pure, damn cheating. At those words, both Draco and Yui gasped, not understanding what she meant. Ryuta was still unconscious, lying on the floor. The next second, the spot where they had just been fighting was bathed in bright light, and a portal appeared. And so, the second floor of the hidden dungeon was cleared. The mid-boss, the metal skull, was defeated. The cleanup team, Ryuta, Yui, Draco, and Juju. They left Ryuta resting on the bed when they returned home. The rest went for a walk and sat quietly with Aunt May. When she heard the whole story, she gasped awkwardly and muttered, "Could Juju really have been trying to poison Yui with poison magic?" Then she gently poked her girl's cheek and muttered that she was such a mischievous one. As it turned out, Juju was Aunt May's adopted daughter. Draco, who was taking a sip from her mug at that very moment, choked involuntarily and set the mug down with a displeased look, and grabbed her sword. She shouted that attempting to take the life of a squad member during a dungeon exploration was utterly unforgivable, and she would cut Juju down right there on the spot. Yui managed to intercept her protector's sword, calmly taking another bite of her dessert, and told her to stop. Draco glared furiously at the main character and shouted that she was too soft. Trust was vital to the squad, and Juju deserved to be expelled from it, at the very least. Juju, hearing these words, flew into a rage. Expel her? She wasn't going anywhere, because she was going to become Ryuta's bride. She spoke these words with tears in her eyes. Just then, Aunt May approached Draco and said that Juju was actually a pretty good girl, just charmingly stubborn with her obsessive ideas. Draco twisted her mouth and asked skeptically, "Charmingly stubborn? Is Aunt May serious?" The next second, Draco told her to be quiet. Despite the argument, Juju said that from the very moment she was found, she had loved Ryuta. She dreamed of becoming his bride, starting a family, and being happy. After those words, tears rolled down her cheeks, and she fell even harder to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. Then the main character approached her. She called her by name. She knelt down beside her. With a gentle smile, she lifted the young girl's chin and told her that she understood how she felt, because she, too, loved Ryuta. And then, with that same gentle smile, she added that she would, of course, remain her big sister. For a couple of seconds, they froze like that, two girls looking into each other's eyes. And then Juju used her poison magic, a venomous bite, and sank her teeth firmly into the protagonist's finger. Draco immediately rushed over to them and dragged the girl away. The main character flashed a smile and said it didn't hurt at all. They were just a mage's teeth, weaklings. Draco wouldn't let it go and declared that this rabid dog needed to be put down. The main character didn't react at all and said that Juju was now her adopted sister. After all, it's actually really cute when your little sister teases you like that. To herself, Juju, standing a little to the side, thought that next time she would definitely kill her. She'd finish her off for sure. Aunt May watched the whole scene from a little ways off and quietly muttered that her adopted daughter was a firecracker. And she chuckled softly. A few days later, they all went into town to do some shopping. Yui turned to her assistant and asked what she thought. Did the sword she was holding look cool enough? Draco peeked over her shoulder, waved her hand awkwardly, and said she was worried about that. Ryuta wasn't ready to handle something like that yet. The main character puckered her lips and asked, "Aren't all swords pretty much the same?" Draco covered her eyes and muttered that these martial arts masters didn't understand ordinary people at all. Yui looked away and muttered, gazing thoughtfully into the distance, that Ryuta's sword was quite impressive. Juju, hearing these words, dropped what she was holding and blushed deeply, asking something about her little brother's sword. 3 days had passed since the squad cleared the second floor. The dungeon city was buzzing with rumors. As they walked, Yui couldn't help but notice the conversations around them. One of the people in the group of elves asked his companions if they'd heard that those who'd cleared the second floor were real monsters. After all, an ordinary person couldn't have taken down that metal skull. How on earth did that even happen? Draco also turned slightly and muttered that they had definitely become the talk of the town. The heroine chuckled softly. The man behind her paid no attention and continued. Had any of them heard that there was some kind of martial arts master there? And some kind of 3-meter-tall troll or something like that? The second one objected. Actually, there was an ogre there who killed the dragon with his bare hands. The third one corrected him again and said he'd heard it was one of the surviving commanders of the Demon King's army. Yui felt as if her heart were being pierced over and over again by those words. She sank to her knees right in the middle of the road. Draco immediately rushed to her and asked if her master was okay. The main character, breathing heavily and flushed, began to mumble. How could they have thought she was a troll, an ogre, or commander of the Demon King? Juju, standing next to her, chuckled quietly and muttered that it wasn't all that far from the truth. The main character stood up and muttered that no, that wasn't nice at all, and she absolutely couldn't let Ryuta find out about any of this. So the newlywed squad rested before their expedition to the third floor of the hidden dungeon. Draco was training outside. The rest were in the kitchen. Ryuta was cooking something, Yui was tasting samples, and Juju was sitting nearby reading books. Ryuta once again let his wife try what he had cooked. She jumped up and down on the spot and said it was very tasty. Then she gasped, grew serious, and muttered that she thought she'd uncovered the secret to the flavor. Then she widened her eyes, cupped her cheeks with her hands, and said that it was most likely love. Her husband walked over to her, blushed, awkwardly rubbed his head with his hand, and muttered that she knew how to make a guy feel embarrassed. Juju sat nearby and scowled, muttering, "Can we stop this public display of affection?" To herself, with tears in her eyes, she thought that her little brother should have been her fiancé. Suddenly, it dawned on the girl. She turned to her older god sister, and with the most innocent expression on her face, she asked her to try her food. The next second, she lifted the lid of the pot. There, floating in the liquid, was a dish that, just by its appearance, screamed, "Under no circumstances should you eat this. It's clearly poisonous." Just then, Draco entered the room. Seeing this, she gasped, and she thought that this was a potion of poison, a stew of death. Then she thought that Juju, that little creature, was trying to kill her master again. The main character blushed, sat down next to her foster sister. She opened her mouth and got ready for Juju to feed her. The next second, Draco grabbed the girl by the scruff of her neck and threw her out of the house along with a plate of death stew, ordering her to calm down. Then, breathing heavily, she thought, there's no peace with any of them in this house. The main character calmly ate the stew her sister had prepared. She checked its status for any ailments beforehand using her special ability. And she said aloud, "What's Draco doing? Yeah, it's a little bitter, but there's no need to get so angry." Draco screamed furiously for the master to stop eating it immediately. And the next second, she slammed the door shut. Juju was left standing out on the street. She lifted her face from the grass and muttered that she would definitely kill Yui. Later that evening, as the moon rose over the city, Ryuta gasped as he stepped out of the bath and muttered that it had actually been a wonderful bath. Then he looked at his wife. She was lying on the bed in a seductive pose, wearing a special nightgown. She was breathing heavily and gasped, and looked at her husband. Then she muttered that they had been in a hidden dungeon for several days and hadn't been able to be alone at all. She was very, very hungry. Then the wife made her move. Her husband's arousal was rapidly increasing. The conditions for activating the newlyweds' connection skill were met. Nighttime, maximum arousal. The merger takes place. Juju stood on the street outside the house and cast a spell. Let everyone be enveloped in the embrace of the Night Queen. Let the abyss swallow their consciousness. The magic of sleep. A dark dream. Then the girl entered the newlyweds' room and found them frozen in the middle of the act, fast asleep. The newlyweds were in a deep sleep. Juju raised her staff, and she jumped up and down on the spot, happily shouting that she had finally knocked out that old hag. And she began muttering that if the main character was asleep, she wouldn't be able to use her skills to cure status ailments. Overcome with emotion, she even gave her so-called older sister a light slap on the chest, causing her to shudder. The next second, Juju was on top of the main character, grabbed a dagger, and muttered that her rival would finally die. But then a voice called out the main character's name. It was Ryuta. Juju instantly stepped back. She knelt down next to the bed and thought, could this really be her chance to be close to her brother? She gently cupped Ryuta's face in her hands and began to slowly move closer to him. Gradually, she brought her face closer and closer, blushing deeply, her eyes glistening with tears. All she could think about was her older brother. When there were only a few centimeters left, suddenly, a powerful blast threw her out of the house. It was Draco. She slashed the air with her sword, sending the girl flying away. The girl cried out that now even the paladin ant was getting in her way. Draco said that she was actually only 21 years old. And then she asked the girl what was wrong with her anyway. Juju smoothed her hair and asked back, what did it matter to her? Her brother was hers and hers alone. Draco stopped beside her, sword at the ready, and said quietly but clearly that she was a stupid girl. She added more loudly that Mr. Ryuta was her master's beloved husband and an irreplaceable member of the squad. Juju thrust her staff forward and asked, who cares anyway? Draco looked at her master, who was fast asleep. She sighed heavily and asked, maybe that girl actually has something to say? But there's a reason why the heroine is challenging the hidden dungeon. The main reason is to reclaim her beloved hometown, to rid it of the wild adventurers who have flooded the streets, and to seal off the dungeon from which the monsters emerged. After all, this city was once Juju's home. Images of the past began to surface in the girl's mind. This made her grip her staff tighter, and she shouted at Draco to shut up. And she asked once more not to stand between her and her brother. And if she did so again, she would surely become her sacrifice. Realizing that words would prove nothing, Draco drew a sword from behind her back and said she wouldn't hold back anymore. It was time to teach this little brat some manners, Am. To be continued. Thanks for watching. Write your feedback in the comments. If you like the story, please like and subscribe. See you soon.